This show is dedicated to helping you strengthen your family tree and live financially free. Welcome to the Marriage, Kids, and Money podcast, everybody. This is Andy Hill, and today we're talking about investing in the stock market outside of your 401k and IRA. Now, with the recent downturn in the market, some people are seeing this as a great time to buy stocks and invest. But where do we start, right? Well, our guest today is J.L. Collins, and he's going to help us answer this question. J.L. Collins is the writer at jlcollinsnh.com and the author of the book, The Simple Path to Wealth, Your Roadmap to Financial Independence and a Rich, Free Life. His simplified investing wisdom has been featured in dozens of five-star podcasts. His featured talk at Google has been viewed over 500,000 times, and even MarketWatch calls his book the #1 book to read if you want to retire early. When JL isn't helping us find a simpler path to wealth, he's spending time with his wife Jane of almost 40 years and his daughter Jessica. Welcome to the show, JL.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the great introduction. I have to tell you, I didn't know that MarketWatch had said that about my book, so I've already learned something new today.
See, I can teach you something, and then you can teach us something, right?
Absolutely, and you went first. I appreciate that.
No problem. Well, let's start. I'm very interested in your path to financial independence. So when did you first decide that this is something you wanted to pursue in your life?
Well, first of all, I think you and your audience should understand that when I made that decision, there was, as far as I knew, there was no concept of financial independence out there. At least I certainly hadn't heard of it. I watched my father have a serious business reversal because he was a cigarette smoker and his health failed. His ability to earn money failed, and along with that, our lifestyle failed because he was not a saver and investor. And that made me realize at a young age that this is or can be a financially precarious world if you don't take steps. And so I knew early on that I wanted to have a financial buffer. I mean, from the time I was in high school, I didn't quite know how to go about that. But once I got in the working world, I started saving half of my income. I started to learn how to invest, and I made every mistake you can possibly make. But nevertheless, it was a start. And if you have a high enough savings rate, it accommodates a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, that's a big choice to make, to save half of your income when you maybe don't have the direction to do that. Were there any influences back in that time where you're saying, hey, I've seen people do it this way and maybe this is why I'm moving that way?
There really weren't. And I've often said my journey was kind of wandering in the wilderness because there was, of course, no internet. There were no personal computers for that matter. So I didn't have any role models. I didn't know anybody else who thought the way I did or was doing what I did. In fact, I often questioned myself because I was so out of step with the people at my office and what have you. But it felt right to me, so I kept coming back to it. And because I started living on 50% of my income from the very beginning, it wasn't a hardship. When my first professional job, and now I'm dating myself, paid me $10,000 a year. So I just approached life as if I was being paid $5,000, and that first $5,000 went right off the top to buy my freedom.
Well, let's talk about how you bought that freedom. So you said you started investing. What did you do at that point to start investing that other portion of your income?
Well, so this would have been 1975, and I didn't know anything about investing at the time, and I'd accumulated, I think, $5,000 just in a savings account. And I was working in downtown Chicago at the time, and about a block from my office, there was a brokerage office, a storefront. I just walked into the brokerage office and I said, I have $5,000 I want to invest. I was appallingly ignorant. I said, I have $5,000 I want to invest. And the nice lady said, well, let me sit you down with one of our brokers. And he asked me a few questions about risk and what have you. And I said the typical things beginners say. I worked hard for this money. I don't want to lose it. I want something safe. And in retrospect, he did me a solid. He put me into Texaco and into Southern Company. Texaco, of course, is an oil company that's been merged into other oil companies at this point. And Southern Company was a utility. And they both at the time paid a handsome dividend and were pretty conservative investments. So I just followed his advice and I bought those two. And they would have actually served me very well over the years had I held them. But of course, the moment they went up a little bit, I got trigger happy and I sold them. So, as I say, I made all the mistakes you can possibly make. That was just the beginning of a long line of them.
So when did you transition from investing in single stocks to index funds? I know that's a big part of your path.
Yeah, and that's kind of an embarrassing question because it took an embarrassingly long time. Coincidentally, as I mentioned, I started investing in 1975, and that just happened to be the year that Jack Bogle brought out the very first index fund, an index 500, S&P 500 fund. I didn't know that at the time, and even if I'd known it, I would not have been wise enough to embrace it. I know that I would have been wise enough to embrace it, by the way, because 10 years later, when a friend of mine in the investment business introduced me to the idea of index funds, I wasn't wise enough to embrace them then. And it took me probably another 15 years before I did. One of the great ironies, by the way, is I actually achieved financial independence before I embraced indexing, picking individual stocks and picking mutual funds that were actively managed and run by stock pickers. And I think that's an important point because it's not like that doesn't work. It's not like you can't achieve your goals there. It's just a whole lot more effort and for a substandard result compared to indexing. So had I embraced indexing when I first heard about it, I'd be far ahead of the game. It would have been a lot easier journey. And if I'd embraced it in 1975, it's, sometimes when I want to punish myself, I think about how far ahead I would be now.
So I guess if you were looking at today with the same choice between individual stock picking and index funds, I know you speak a lot about index funds now, and you say there's no right way or wrong way. Why do you think index funds would be a better choice for people today, or would they be?
Well, I think there is a right way and a wrong way. I mean, I shouldn't say maybe not right or wrong, but there are better ways and less better ways. And indexing is more powerful. Study after study has shown that it's almost impossible to outperform the index over any significant period of time. Professionals can't do it. Now, there's some people who make the case that individuals have advantages over professionals, and that's true, they do, but they also lack the resources that professionals have. So I think on balance, that's probably an equal playing field. And when people tell me that they've outperformed the index over years on their own, I say that's great. Glad you did it. I don't really believe it, but if you're happy, I don't care. You can go do whatever you want to do. The research where it can be verified is overwhelmingly indicates that in any given year or two, there's going to be maybe 25% of active managers that outperform. You stretch that out to 15 years, it drops considerably. You stretch it out to 30 years, and it's less than 1%. And that's essentially zero. So indexing is more powerful, and it's certainly a whole lot easier. And that's hence the title, The Simple Path to Wealth. It's written for people who don't want to spend all their time trying to figure out investing to get substandard results when they could just get a couple of things right, outperform over time, and go about living their lives and doing more productive things.
Yeah, that's what we're all about on the show, is a simpler way to do things. And the people you were talking about too are, busy, maybe active investors that are trying to figure this out. And there's a lot of people who are listening to the show right now. They just want to invest. They want to do something that's simple and easy for their family and not think about it all day long. So talk about some other advantages of index funds. I know that it's obviously a simpler path to do it, but there are other advantages as well, right?
Well, I think maybe it's a time to step back and talk about what an index fund is, and then you can kind of see how it comes together. So an active manager who runs a fund is out trying to figure out what companies and what stocks they're by are going to do better than others and choose the winners and avoid the losers. And that sounds great in theory. In fact, it sounds so great in theory. That's why it took me personally so long to embrace indexing, because I look at it and I say, gee, if I could just avoid a few bad companies, I'd outperform the index. Or if I could just pick a few good companies, I'd outperform them. But that's surprisingly difficult to do over time. The index, on the other hand, says you really can't do that effectively over time. You certainly can't overcome the costs of doing that over time, because actively managed funds have to pay those managers. you as the investor have to pay that fee. So instead of trying to do it, and this was Bogle's brilliant insight, you just buy everything in the index. I prefer the total stock market index fund, and I prefer Vanguard's, which is VTSAX. And they simply buy literally every publicly traded company in the United States. And therefore, I don't have to worry about which companies are going to outperform and which are going to fail. Those that fail drift off the index, and they usually before they go to zero. And of course, the most you can lose on those is 100%. Those that succeed can certainly go up 100%, but they can also go up 200% or 500 or 1,000 or 10,000%. And so you have this process that, and I'm kind of proud of this term that I coined, that's self-cleansing. So the S&P 500 fund or the total stock market index fund made up of this group of funds, or a group of companies, a group of stocks in the fund, it's continually cleansing itself. The ones that fail fall off. New, exciting companies that are coming up and have been created get at it. The winners are allowed to run, and that's why it continually outperforms and continually goes up over time, even though it can be a wild and volatile ride, as certainly the last few weeks have shown us.
Absolutely. We're in a major volatile time. So you mentioned Vanguard as a place you like to invest. Why Vanguard versus other things? You know, there's a wave of interest in apps like Robinhood and things like that right now. Why Vanguard over something like Robinhood?
Vanguard is unique, and this is another part of Jack Bogle's brilliance. Vanguard is unique in the way it's structured. And the way it's structured is when you buy the fund, any fund that Vanguard puts out, you become an owner of Vanguard. And that doesn't happen in any other investment company. So when you buy a Fidelity fund, you're buying a fund from them, but Fidelity is owned by the Johnson family. It's privately held, and there are probably some other shareholders. Fidelity has two masters to serve. It has you, the investor, and they certainly want to do a good job for you because that way you stay invested and you keep putting your money with them. But the main master they're serving are the owners. And that's true of any business. That doesn't make them bad guys. It's just a characteristic. With Vanguard, their interests are completely aligned with yours as the investor because you're not only an investor, you're an owner. T. Rowe Price is a publicly traded company. So it's the same thing as Fidelity. They're certainly going to try to do the best job they can for their fund owners, but their primary job is deliver return to their shareholders. And that's a profound difference. And the profound difference is shown where the core value of Vanguard is to continually drive down fees. The core objective of the other companies is to charge as much for their product as they can, consistent with, of course, serving their customers, so they can deliver the maximum value to their shareholders. This is not a bad thing. This is not a corrupt thing. This is the same thing that General Motors does when they sell cars. You know, they're trying to sell those cars for as much money as they can, consistent with getting people to buy as many as they can for the benefit of their shareholders. Same thing with Apple. Apple makes devices. They're trying to sell them for as much money as they can, consistent with selling as many as they can to the maximum benefit of their shareholders. Both those companies, and every company does that by trying to put a great product in front of their customers. But make no mistake, their customers are not their primary master.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've been investing with Vanguard for a while. I enjoy the products that they have, and I enjoy how simple it is as well, too. So I want to speak to the person right now who is, you know, looking at this market and saying, yeah, I've been investing in my 401k and my Roth IRA and things like that, but I want to take advantage of where we are in the market right now. It sounds like index funds and Vanguard are a good place for people to check out. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what, again, Vanguard is my favorite. Let me also quickly make the point that if you are interested in buying a total stock market index fund, which is my preference, or an S&P 500 index fund, which is almost equally good, an index fund is an index fund. So if you buy a total stock market index fund from Fidelity, you're going to get a very similar portfolio to Vanguard's. It might be a little bit different because sometimes they track slightly different indexes, but essentially an index fund is an index fund. So any of your listeners who are currently invested with Fidelity or some other firm and they like them, they're comfortable with them, they shouldn't feel compelled to change to Vanguard. Vanguard's my choice, and I think as we already discussed, there are reasons for that. If you're starting from scratch, I would say, anybody who asks me personally, I would go to Vanguard. And you can log on to the Vanguard website and probably get started with a few mouse clicks. If you're uncomfortable doing that, you pick up the phone and talk to the representative and say, hey, I want to open an account, and they'll walk you through it.
Absolutely. It's a point at which maybe people are saving for a while in their retirement and they think, well, I'd like to have a little bit more money today. And I keep hearing about this concept of early retirement. That sounds really nice. How does somebody make that decision of when to stop investing in their 401k or IRA versus a taxable brokerage? Or do they do both? How does somebody make that decision?
Well, I think, first of all, if you are making the decision to be financially independent at a relatively young age or at a relatively short period of time, and by the way, you don't have to start at a young age to become financially independent. So if you have a savings rate of about 50%, which is what I did, the numbers tell us that's going to take you about 14 years to get to FI based on the various metrics we can talk about later. That doesn't matter if you start at the age of 20 or you start at the age of 50. It's going to take about a decade and a half or a little bit less. If you are going to save at that kind of rate, at a 50% or greater rate to get to FI in some relatively short amount of time, by definition, you're probably already going to be maxing out your tax-advantaged accounts like IRAs and 401ks. And you're going to have extra money to invest in all likelihood, and that's when you open a taxable account. So I guess my advice would be first fund your tax-advantaged accounts and then open your taxable account. But that's probably going to happen at the same time if you have the kind of savings rate it's going to take to achieve FI in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah. Can you talk about why it's important to take advantage of those tax advantage accounts first?
Well, first of all, there's only so much that you can put into tax-advantaged accounts, and they reduce your taxes right now, which allows more money to be invested and then to grow and earn over time. And there is a presumption made that when you, I don't like the word retire, but when you start living on the portfolio and you start drawing on those accounts, you will be in a lower tax bracket. So you avoid paying tax in your peak earning years or in your earning years where you're paying relatively high taxes. You give up your earned income, you start living on the portfolio. Presumably, your income and your tax bracket drops at that point. So even though you have to pay taxes ultimately to the government, you're going to be doing it at a lower rate. Now, there's a lot of assumptions in there. Who knows what tax bracket, if you're a young person and you're looking out 20, 30 years, who knows what tax brackets will be, but it's a bird in the hand. And so that's the immediate advantage.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so let's say we're starting to build up our portfolio, whether it's in retirement or in a taxable brokerage. We hear a lot about portfolio diversification. So how can investors keep this diversification choice simple?
Well, that's a really interesting question because, for me anyway, because occasionally, I recommend only two funds. I recommend VTSAX, which is Vanguard's Total Stock Market Index Fund. And I recommend that when you're in your earning years and you have cash flow coming. That's the only fund I think you need. My daughter's a good example. That's what I've told her. That's the only fund. She's young and working, and every month she's putting money in. So when the market takes one of its periodic expected natural drops like it is now, then she benefits from that drop because she has that cash flow. And some people say, well, what about diversification? I mean, isn't that important? You're only recommending one fund. We have to step back and realize what that one fund is. As we said earlier, with that one fund, you own virtually every publicly traded company in the United States. That's last count somewhere around 3,600 companies. Now, to put that in perspective, because sometimes, people get a little off track, I think, worrying about diversification. When I was young, which is a long, long time ago, and index funds didn't exist, at least initially, the recommendation to have a well-diversified portfolio, typically you were buying individual stocks because that was the most available option. a well-diversified portfolio was defined as owning 7 or 8 industries, right? So picking 7 or 8 sectors, and then picking 1 or 2 companies within those sectors, and that was your portfolio. And that was considered well diversified. Well, that's maybe 15, 16 stocks all together. But that was a well diversified portfolio. So when people say to me, JL, you only want one fund, you're not diversified enough. I think, yeah, I think you kind of don't quite understand what that one fund is and what diversification used to look like.
Thousands of companies instead of 17, right? That makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. Okay, well, let's talk about early retirement, because we poked at it a little bit there. You said 14 to 15 years if you're doing this path right at 50%. How can somebody do that? Can you walk us through that?
How could they do it from what point of view?
Let's say somebody is starting today and they're 30 years old and they said, you know what? I think this is a great idea. I think I can do this in the next 14 to 15 years if I live on 50%. What would be their first step to walk a simple path to financial independence?
Well, I suppose the first step is if they're 30 years old and they haven't had a high savings rate, if they're like most people, they're probably they're probably spending rather most of their income. Maybe, and most Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So maybe if they're really ahead of the curve, they're saving 5 or 10%, and that's not going to get you to early retirement. That's barely going to get you to a retirement at 65 or 70. So the first thing they're going to need to do is look at their expenses and figure out how to organize their life in such a fashion to live on a lot less. That's step number one. And that's a tough step, and I appreciate that. And I think the way you reconcile it is you have to say, well, how important is my financial freedom? Because that's really what you're buying. So I had a conversation with a woman one time a number of years ago who said, this sounds great, but in the family I grew up in, spending money is what we did. And this would just feel like so much deprivation if I stopped spending money the way I am in order to do this. And I said, well, it's just a different way of spending money. It's just instead of going out and buying a new car or a fancier house or remodeling your kitchen, or you're choosing to buy your freedom. And it's not my job or responsibility to tell anybody what to do with their money. It's your money. You can do whatever you want to do with it. What I would suggest is think about how valuable is financial freedom to you. And if you find yourself putting off because that's what you're buying with investing. And if you find yourself putting off setting aside that money and investing it in order to buy the fancier car or to remodel the kitchen or the wardrobe, then clearly financial independence is not that valuable to you. And that's okay. I mean, everybody lives their own life. It's not reasonable to say, I still want to keep buying all those things I've been buying. I still want to keep living the same life I've been living, and I want to be financially independent. You're going to have to make some hard choices.
On your path, then, what was it about financial independence or early retirement at that time that excited you? I mean, was it getting out of the work that you were in, being able to spend more time with family? What was your driving force?
Well, as I said earlier, I watched what happened to my father and by extension our family, and I never wanted to be in that vulnerable position. So I think that was the start of it. And then there was just living. I never felt deprived. I mean, it just, if you sit back and you think about it, and that first $10,000 job that I had, well, if I hadn't been pursuing financial independence and I'd had a $5,000 a year job, I would have figured out how to live on that, because that's what you kind of have to do. And then, of course, I didn't stay making $10,000 as my income grew. So did the amount of money I had to spend. I mean, because when it went to $20,000, now I'm doubling both my investment money and my living money. So it just never particularly felt like deprivation to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good path to live, and you've created a lot of opportunity for yourself. So I understand you've traveled around the world and spent a lot of good time with your family and been able to give back, too, especially with this interview today. I really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us. Where could people find you, read your blog, and maybe purchase this book that you have?
Well, the easiest way to find me is jlcollinsnh.com. That's the blog. You can also find me on Twitter and Facebook, but the blog is sort of the center of everything, and if you go to the blog, you'll see a copy of the book in the upper right-hand corner, and you click on that, it takes you to Amazon. I would hasten to say there is nothing in the book that you can't find on the blog, and that was by design and actually went against the recommendation that book publishing people gave me. The recommendation was make sure there are things in the book that they can't find in the blog, so they have to buy the book. And I thought, well, that's kind of a bad thing to do. I mean, I want the information to be available. So the book it's a little better organized and a little more concise, and I think the writing's a little more polished. At least I spent more time polishing it. I'll let the readers decide. So, and you can find the book on Amazon. You can get it at your library. But all the information is on the blog itself. And on the blog, there's a section called the Stock Series. That's where most of the information is. So I'd suggest anybody listening go first to the blog, read the Stock Series, or at least read a few of the posts in the Stock Series and see if this resonates with you. And if it does, you'll get everything out of the blog if you want to do that. And if you want to take the next step and buy the book, then that's great. You'll help pay for my travels.
Absolutely. Well, I've enjoyed the book a lot. I've actually given it away on this show a couple times. So I really appreciate you being here to share this knowledge with us. And for those who are starting to invest right now, to help them create a simpler path to financial independence. JL, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for recommending the book. I appreciate it.